So, welcome everybody to the final panel of CXC 2022. Yay! Stop your fingers,
Thank you all for not flying away yet.
So, come on in here. Come on. No.
I'm scared.
We are here to talk about Mathew Klickstein's new book called See You at San Diego, which is an oral history of how the San Diego Comic-Con was founded by a bunch of unlikely comic geeks who came together to create a place to celebrate the lowly art form of comic books and everything that's really cool in pop culture, like monsters and science fiction. So please welcome Mathew Klickstein.
Thank you all for having me. And I have to say really quick, just because it's so direct and to hear, my wife and I, as some of you know, moved out here to Dayton area right before the pandemic and right actually before I started working on the book. But I just had another book come out, an actual comic book series through Aftershock, You Are Obsolete. And so I was doing some touring locally and had gone to a store that I'd heard a lot about called Laughing Ogre. And the people there were great, and I met some of the people that were doing podcast stuff there, and it was really like, again, like one of those clubhouse community comic book stores that I appreciated and kind of hung out and became friendly with some of the people. And one of the people who was involved with the store wrote an incredible review of You Are Obsolete that not only was very praising and nice, it's always nice, but really got at a lot of the nuances that I was trying to put into the book and the story. It's very influenced by a lot of the people that are in this book, your Ray Bradburys and people along those lines, Robert Heinlein and others like that who are part of the con scene. And I just really appreciated the review. I actually told the owner of the store, Gib, as many of you probably know, that, wow, who wrote this? I want to meet this person. And it turned out to be Michael. And we started kind of hanging out and became friendly. And, so a big part of why I'm here is because of Michael's work. And also one of the people, Rich Wagner from Home Base Heroes podcast, had connected me to Jeff for the forward. And so being out here in this area really helped a lot with my being here and also getting the great and amazing Jeff Smith to do the forward to our book and then being invited to this and then getting to do this with Michael has also been very special. So I love the local connections here is what I'm getting at, even from a guy from Los Angeles and New York to be able to enjoy it out here like that. So I appreciate it.
I actually was watching, I think it was Jimmy Kimmel a couple nights ago. And this is about Columbus, Ohio. There was apparently some kind of poll about what city swears the most. Number one, Columbus fucking Ohio. For real, that's what it was. I was like, you're kidding. That's fucking nuts. Okay, so Michael's actually probably going to handle most of this interview. I'm just going to jump in there whenever there's something that I really want to say, or if you
I'll pass
if you want me to.
Well, that's a lot of. I do want to be very clear, and I know we'll probably get into this in Michael's questions. But I do want to be clear that this is, as an oral history, it's not me. I know in a lot of other oral histories, a genre that I've always really enjoyed, and I really appreciate people like the pioneers like Studs Terkel and just people doing field recordings like Alan Lomax and others like that. But it's all of their stories all cut together, very much like a Talking Heads documentary. And so when I have an opportunity for someone like Jeff Smith to be here, it's great because this isn't my story. This is Jeff's story and other people like Jeff. So I will definitely hand stuff off to him and go, well, I wasn't there, Jeff. You talk about this. And so that's a lot of what the book is and why I think it's an important resource, especially if anyone in here is academically inclined. We're really trying to get this into libraries and colleges. I'm going to different colleges and stuff because this is the raw information from the people who are there, people like Trina Robbins and others that have been part of this festival even while we're here. So.
Well, first I should say that the book is available at bookstores. It's at local comic shops now. Fantagraphics has it up at their booth. So if you haven't picked up the book yet, please go get it. It's very good. It's the definitive history of Comic-Con. It's very enjoyable, and the way that the information is presented is very engaging. You feel like you're kind of in a room with a bunch of people having a conversation about all this stuff. It's great. So may as well start at the beginning. The book is actually an adaptation of your podcast that you did for Sirius. It was about a year and a half ago, or year ago. And so I just wanted to see if you could talk about how this all started, what the genesis of the project was.
Yeah, did the screen go off, by the way? Is there it's not the biggest deal in the world. Just be great if there's pictures.
No,
or
I
anything.
saw it fade, and I was like, I thought I was going to stay.
That was actually done by Scott Shaw, who's one of the ultimate co-founders of Comic-Con. He's a big part of the story in the book. He also is very involved in things like Hanna-Barbera. He did DC's Captain Carrot. He's worked with so many other people. He's done a lot of Simpsons magazines and such. He's one of the people that I was very excited to have involved, and we've become very close. And he sees this, like a lot of folks like Trina and many others, as kind of their stories getting out there in a bit more. Because unfortunately, as we all appreciate people like Scott and Trina and some of the other people who are in the book, not everyone has the biggest spotlight on them, even though they might deserve it. So it's great to have something that we could put all their stories and images and such together. And Scott was nice enough to make a special art just for this book, and it's done in Sergio style.
I want to say I reckon this is a drawing of the El Cortez.
Exactly.
This is where the very first cons were held, at this kind of flea bag hotel. And, but it had a pool, and there's one of the stories in the book is a rocket firework that went off. So that's referenced in there. So
Also, somebody dumped shark repellent in the pool at one point.
Oh,
right?
really?
Yeah.
Oh, that was probably a bad thing.
No, they were trying to be kind of screwy, because a lot of things too that people might not know is they were the folks who put this together were extremely influenced by all different kinds of stimulation from writing. And one of the people that was really inspiring a lot of them in that regard, even the ones who were not drug people, was Hunter S. Thompson. Many of them, despite being what we would later call straight edge, were really into Hunter S. Thompson, and there was even a band that would play there where it was like Dr. Teeth or something like that, except he was Dr. Thompson, and Roger Friedman, one of the Comic-Con co-founders, would kind of take on this persona and lead a band of all these different people and songs and such like that. It was probably a little bit before your time. It was sort of in the earliest
Yeah,
eras.
no, your book is pretty much right up to my time.
Yeah.
It's pretty much.
Because when you were there, probably Seduction of the Innocent was playing. Bill
Yep,
Mumy's
that was
band.
still going on. Yeah.
Yeah. You want to talk a little bit about that? We'll get back to your question in a
Sure.
second, but just it's a good opportunity.
Sorry.
No.
I would think a lot of people here know who Bill Mumy is. But,
Bill Mumy was the kid on Lost in Space.
and Twilight
Danger
Zone
Will
as
Robinson.
well.
He was Will Robinson.
He's the one in Twilight Zone who turns the guy into the Jack in the Box.
Oh,
as
yeah.
well. Yeah.
When I started going, Comic-Con was it was about 20 years old, but it had really only come into its own maybe a few years before, where it got into starting to look like what it looks like now. But yeah, it was small enough. I forget, like 40,000 people or 20,000. It was maybe 20,000 people, which seemed like an incredible amount. We hadn't seen anything yet, but they were small enough that they still had like cotillions. They would have like a little dance, and the Seduction of the Innocent was the name of this band, and Bill Mumy was in it. Who were some?
Miguel Ferrer, the actor, and they actually did some comic books together for Marvel.
There's
because they
pictures
met
of them
me.
all with
Yeah.
Mark Hamill, like sitting at the feet
Yeah.
of like.
Oh, Mark Hamill was really into
Jack
them.
Kirby
Yeah.
and.
They were like the house band that would play Comic-Con every year because Jackie couldn't find a better band, and they were like, we could do it. Steve Lealoha, I think, was in it for a while.
Yes,
They would
yeah.
obviously have people coming and going because all these creators and such that were coming to Comic-Con, many of them were also musicians, of course. They're all different kinds of artists.
We were just talking about this show. We were talking today about what about if because usually we do this. I'm talking about CXC now. We're really all over the place. CXC is usually the last weekend of September when it's still warm, but the skies are still this clear. But we're thinking about next year because every cartoonist is probably in some little band, right?
Matt
Maybe try to
Groening is.
set up a little, maybe have bands out by the food trucks or something.
Sure.
Let them play.
That'd be fun.
What were we talking about? Oh, I want to tell one story about the dances at Comic-Con. So we would go, the first year I went, I immediately fell in with other troublemakers like Dave Sim, Colleen Doran, Bob Burden, who did Flaming Carrot. Best advice I ever got at any comic book convention came from Bob Burden. We were at the dance, and we were standing on the side, we were watching people dance, and Bob Burden says, "Son, don't ever let your fans see you dance." And I never did.
You got to get that on a shirt. You'd make some really good money. But to answer your question, going back to the provenance of all this, I had originally wanted to do a book like this toward the end of 2019, early 2020, because the 50th anniversary of Comic-Con had just happened. And I was working with a literary agent at the time, and for those who don't know, I do specialize in projects like this. I also did an oral history of Nickelodeon about 10 years ago that somehow, I don't know how, became a clue on Jeopardy a couple of weeks ago. As I was texted by a number of friends that I would have thought never would have watched Jeopardy. One guy actually records every episode, so he sent me the clip. I really don't know how that happened, and I did a Simpsons book, and I write a lot about pop culture history, and wanted to do this in large part because I wanted to do the entire pop culture history, the entire fandom, and how to do that so that it would be manageable and tenable. I decided to focus on the prehistory, history, and expansion of the largest pop culture gathering worldwide. A lot of people kind of talk about it that way, but according to the Guinness Book of World Records, it's probably changed over the last couple of years with COVID and whatnot. Comic-Con was the largest pop culture gathering. And again, not comic convention, pop culture gathering. That's the category it's in. And so I wanted to do that story. I knew a woman, Wendy All. I don't know if you ever met her, but she was one of the original committee members. And she helped me get in touch with everybody, and we started putting stuff together and figuring it out. I was doing research, and then COVID happened. But I wanted to keep going because I'd already done all this work, and I was interviewing these people and gotten friendly with them, and we were worried about their ages. I wanted to make sure we got them on record before they were gone, especially with COVID. One guy, Gene Henderson, told me he would not be around when this came out. He unfortunately was right, but I'm really glad we got him in here before he was gone. And so we just kept going, and my buddy who was a producer at SiriusXM, which was one of the companies that said, COVID, excellent, we can make some money off of this. Everyone's going to be home. They decided to do more original content. So we did it as a podcast series. You can all hear it. You don't have to have SiriusXM to do. It's called Comic-Con Begins. It's got archival stuff in it from early cons. You can hear Stan Lee. You can hear Ray Bradbury cussing about why Mad Magazine is the only publication people should read because both liberal and conservative publications are full of falsities. So you should read Mad Magazine. He's talking about this in 1970 at the con. Crystal clear archival stuff too, because there was a bunch of AV nerds doing it. But Ho-Che Anderson and Stan Sakai were involved. They liked it enough to tell Gary about it. At Fantagraphics, I liked Fantagraphics' own oral history, We Told You So, which I highly recommend. Gary listened to the podcast, and we went forward. And then a year later, here we are, talking to a room of 6 people about this, most of whom I already know.
Well,
With Jeff Smith next to me, though, so that makes up for it.
But so, did you find that like anybody was reluctant about getting involved? Because I know there's like some controversies there about certain people, and maybe some people didn't want to drudge that back up again, especially after people have already passed on, that sort of thing.
That's a good point. There's definitely a lot of discussion about. Did you ever meet Sheldorf?
I did.
What's your take? Let me start with a person who knew him. What's your take on
I didn't
Sheldorf?
really know him.
What little interaction you had with him?
I don't know.
Sheldorf was the founder of Comic-Con. There were a lot of people who were kind of there and helped to make it. You got to remember this was a lot of kids. They weren't really writing things down. There weren't pictures. It was one of the things that made it difficult putting a project like this together. People weren't taking pictures of everything, both because they didn't have the technology. Also, they weren't very wealthy, so they didn't have nicer cameras and stuff around, and they didn't really think to do that because they were just a bunch of kids who wanted to.
It really was kids.
Yeah.
It really was like high school.
So it was hard to
kids.
tell who did what.
And then there was a couple of older guys that were comic books, either in comic book stores or owned a comic book store, and Sheldorf was one of those guys. He was a comic book collector before there were comic book collectors. Mostly it was just kids trading them, at home and with each other in neighborhoods. So Shell was one of those kind of early guys, and somehow through one comic book shop or another, you'll have to read the book and get details. This group of high school kids kind of got together with Shell, and Shell kind of, I would say he was an important player in it. I felt like him saying he was the founder was a bit incorrect. It's sort of like Stan Lee saying he created the Fantastic Four. Okay,
Right.
He did not. He was a really good editor.
That.
He was a good editor.
Shell's been compared to like a Stan Lee or like a Steve Jobs,
Yeah.
where it's like the idea was definitely there, but did he do any work?
Yeah.
That's what seems to be debated. A lot of people have compared Shell's contribution to a Steve Jobs or to a Stan Lee or a Thomas Edison, both in a good and a bad way.
Well, that's what Michael said. Is there was you could feel it you could see it in when people talk about it. They were like kind of getting a little they were getting a little cranky about him, like hogging all the credit.
There were a lot of people and it's in the book. It's one of the reasons
the
also
book.
I have to say that I'm proud of this being an oral history, and why I like doing oral histories is because it's not my speculation. It's not a synthesis after analysis. It's quite literally everybody. And one of the things that's both fun and I think important for authenticity's sake is with an oral history is I can have people disagree with each other. I can have them ameliorate each other's sentences or statements. Well, that happened, but also this happened, or expand upon things, or remember things differently. But there is an entire chapter in here, as there's an entire episode in the podcast just about Sheldorf. He really was a Citizen Kane type, or a Stan Lee, or a Steve Jobs type, where there are a lot of people who bow down and say, he was really the guy, but there are also some of those people even say he was not such a great person. And so there's a lot of discussion about that in the book and what Shell's real contributions were or were not. Someone actually, one of the first things that came out about the book at all in San Diego was someone wrote a piece about in defense of Sheldorf for like the San Diego Tribune or something, and said they really appreciated how balanced the chapter was. I've gotten that from a lot of people, including Gary Groth. And and a lot of people are like, oh man, and everyone agrees that the chapter is very balanced, because there are people who say they're glad that Shell's dead and that they wish they had never met him. And there are other people who are like, if he was alive today, I'd shake his hand. And so we have all in between.
When I met him, it was probably in the mid-'90s. When did he pass?
He passed in 2009, the 40th anniversary of Comic-Con. His life also weirdly led up. He also was kicked out of Comic-Con in 1984, which we all know is like a big geek year. Like, Shell's life very much paralleled this in a very interesting way. But,
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I'm sorry, my story is not very interesting. It was probably closer to 2000 then.
Okay, so about 10 years before he passed.
Yeah. Really? 2000?
He passed in 2009.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah, so he was...
It must have been later even then.
Okay.
But I met him, was that during one of the Eisners or something? Jackie came and got me and said, I want to introduce you to someone. And it was Shell. And it was definitely, I was being presented to Shell. But it was very polite. It was very nice. We didn't say much. I did get to shake his hand, but that's it. That was it. Nothing exciting.
Yeah, it was an interesting person, and there's a lot of nuance with people in there. And to answer your question, so when we were working on the podcast, there were a few people who I'd reached out to that I would hope it would be involved. There's not a lot of people here, so what the heck? I was really hoping to get Art Spiegelman, and he was nice enough we were emailing back and forth about it, and he was kind of being supportive from afar, and we talked about a few different things, but he just wasn't interested in being actually in it. And there were a couple of other people like that. He was obviously like the bigger name. I wanted RZA from Wu-Tang for the podcast series, and I went through 6 representatives and over a year of talking with them. And when I finally heard back and they said, hey, he has some time now, the podcast had already come and gone, but we're doing the book. And I said, look, we're almost done. Can you do like the afterward? So we did a remote a Zoom, and I turned that into the afterward with his involvement, and that was kind of fun, which I wanted to use to kind of showcase that this is about something larger than Comic-Con, larger than comics, as is Comic-Con itself. It's really an intersection of so many different fandoms and pop cultures. Jeff said it best at the beginning. It wasn't just comics. It was movies and animation and monsters and science fiction from the very beginning. So that's very important too. For when the book version came together after the podcast series, most people were very supportive and really involved. That's how I was able to do it, how I got a lot of the pictures and art, especially so quickly. People have been extremely supportive promoting it as such, especially people like Stan Sakai and Scott Shaw and Maggie Thompson and a few others, which has been great, especially those particular people. I did a really fun event with Trina Robbins at the San Francisco Cartoon Museum just a few weeks ago. If anyone has anyone in Chicago area, I'm doing City Lit with Tim Seeley later this month also, and a few other people around. So it's been overall pretty good, but we'll see. Definitely, I think whatever happens during the Eisners this year will kind of be very interesting to see how that comes together. But we'll see. But everyone's been very supportive for the most part.
Great. You have these interviews, and they're kind of they're diced up and put in the appropriate areas, different sections of the book. Do you want to talk about how maybe you decided how to work that out? Because I'm assuming you were like talking to one person at a time, and then you kind of split this stuff up over across the entire book instead of like putting them all in one spot from one person. And sometimes there are people that seem to be interacting with each other, and other times it seems like they're just kind of alone. Do you want to talk about that at all? Like how you decided to present it in that manner?
Yeah, and he's right. Again, because I also make documentaries and I've done this kind of project before, I really take a lot of pride in how I seamlessly put together the interviews. And I'm thinking about that when I'm originally doing the interviews. As I said, I did a Nickelodeon book, and for that I talked to 250 people. So that was a lot. It was thousands of pages of transcriptions, and I had friends who had to help me out and all that. For this, it was a lot better, at least for the book, because I had already had the scripts that I would wanted to use for the podcast series. That's what I had put together. And I had already kind of cut everything together like it was a documentary for the podcast series. And then I worked with the editors and producers at SiriusXM on cutting it down from what was at the time about probably 50 hours down to about 6 or 7, and that's with some of the archival stuff and whatnot. So when I got started on the book, I basically just went back to those original scripts of like the 50 hours. If you listen to this, it's probably 50 hours. By the way, it actually did come out, I think last week, as an audiobook also. And Scott Shaw and a few other people do the performance, the vocal performance of it. So I went right back to that again. And, it's just something I've always been good at. I get lost if you give me directions. I can't play the guitar, I can't draw, I can't cook. There's a lot of things I can't do, but I can somehow put together projects like this, and I really enjoy it, and I've just gotten better at it over the years. But there are parts, some of my favorites, when people are disagreeing with each other, or as you said, the best example is Stan Sakai and Kevin Eastman both kind of talk about how Usagi Yojimbo became part of the Teenage Mutant Turtles universe, and how they were both sitting at the funny animals table by the bathroom. That's where they always put everybody, and they both kind of talk about that, how always having to be by the bathroom. And then suddenly Turtles started getting big, and Kevin and Peter asked Stan if he wanted Usagi to be in there as a toy and on the show. Stan talks about like he didn't even have any lawyers or anything at the time, so they helped him with that. And Kevin's talking about it too. And so they were just kind of bouncing each other back and forth. What's fun is on the podcast series, you can actually hear them, and it sounds like they're having a conversation with each other, just kind of tapping off and telling this story of how Usagi Yojimbo got into Turtles. And there's a few different other parts like that too, where everyone's kind of finishing each other's sentences, all kind of talking about the same kind of cool event that happened. Another big one that's one of my favorites is when Star Wars came about a year early. It was represented when it was still called The Star Wars in 1976. And they brought out Howard Chaykin and Roy Thomas, and they were pushing the comic book. And a guy named Charlie Lippincott was one of the first people to say, hey, we should bring Hollywood down here. There's a bunch of people here who are really into stuff. And not only will they like this, but maybe they'll help talk about it with other people and get other people interested, almost kind of using it as a social media type of a situation or a focus group. And Charlie, we have pictures of him and people talk about him, unfortunately just passed away during COVID right before I started working on this, so I didn't get to talk to him. But we did talk to another guy, Paul M. Salmon, who was part of that. Well, a couple guys that started bringing Hollywood down, David Lynch and others, they showed, they started saying, hey, we have a group down here that'll watch these things. Ghostbusters comes in 83, a little bit early. Everything's coming a little early. And then, of course, things start to change dramatically. But there's a great section on when Star Wars first came, and everyone kind of being like, something was about to happen. It was going to be different. This is not Time Tunnel. It's not even Star Trek. And just the way that Hollywood came, in addition to the power of the film itself, was just, it changed things. And that seems to be when things really, went hog wild with Hollywood coming down, Hall H and everything. Kind of started with that.
Well, that was the beginning, but it really happened in 2000 when the Lord of the Rings
Sure.
came down. Because I'd been there all through the 90s, and it was big. But when Peter Jackson set up the Lord of the Rings thing, and this was the first time they had big tote bags
Sure.
that had the Hobbit or the Lord of the Rings on it, whatever the first one was, Fellowship. That changed. That was the real change, because then Hollywood came every year more and more after that. But I mean, obviously, they did Turtles was in '90. We saw some of the early Turtles puppets,
Oh, cool.
The heads and stuff.
Yeah.
They had those there in the early '90s.
Wow.
Jim Henson did the first Turtles movie. Yeah, that was fun. But but the craziness happened in with Lord of the Rings.
Jim Valentino in the book, who I'm sure a lot of you know, Jim was actually, like a lot of these guys, one of the early people to help put together, and just later on would go on to become the co-founder and publisher of Image. But a lot of these people, that kind of thing happened. One of the guys who was helping as a program director really helped Dark Horse get off the ground, Dave Scroggie. But Jim talks very specifically about when he went there and the Pirates of the Caribbean ship was in the hall, and he's talked about it multiple times. But for him, that was the flashpoint. And Gus Kruger, the son of Ken Kruger, where the kids all met for the bookstore, talks all the time about when he first saw the big Time Machine movie, like the big one that was done, the crappy remake of a couple years ago. So everyone's kind of got their like image, you know.
Well, I'm saying, like,
but I'm
when
sure,
I
like I
started,
wasn't, but it's just
I
funny.
was
Everyone remembers these
The
things.
second year that Comic-Con was not in the hotel, but was in the official convention center with booth sales.
Yeah.
But it was only a few. Hall H did not even exist. It
Yeah,
was
just
just
expanded largely.
yeah.
for
Well, we
Comic-Con.
started. We were not even in one whole hall.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
were just. They had like maybe one whole hall open up, but then they had us walled off with little black curtains, and then it slowly, began to expand just with comics. But then, like I said, they actually had to open up the whole thing once. They actually then decided to build an extra building.
Yeah.
It's double the size. That's when Hall H came in.
Right. Yeah.
So
They had to
that
kind
was
of
later.
And there's a lot about that in San Diego itself also in the story, because many of the people obviously who helped to create it were San Diego natives for the most part, but even they were transplants. A lot of people came out in the early to mid 50s because there was the naval base there and a lot was going on with aerospace, and many of the people who's were helping to create Comic-Con, their dads and even mothers were involved in aerospace and the space age stuff going on. One of the guys, Roger Friedman again, who would go on to be Dr. Thompson in his Dr. Raoul Duke in the as part of his band or whatever it was. His dad was involved over at Cape Canaveral, and they talk about how it's not really that big of a coincidence. It was just a few months earlier that the moon landing happened. Comic-Con starts in 1970, right after that. Also, there's a lot of discussion about how important Space Oddity was for them, and why David Bowie was such a big deal, because he's combining science fiction and rock and roll very explicitly. Some people were even like, it made sense to them that he would have been in Man Who Fell to Earth, and now why that would have all come together with David Bowie. So they had that happening, Manson family stuff, Woodstock, what was going on with Nixon, all that's impacting them, especially because they are young. And a lot of them told me, we were seeing kids putting together Woodstock, we were seeing kids going up at Berkeley and coming down and talking to us about doing free speech protests and stuff. And they were like, we want to do something too. We'll do something for this.
Talk a little bit about the actual guys like Scott Shaw. And
Yeah.
how they were like seeking out like Jack Kirby.
Oh
and
yeah,
stuff.
they
Talk about
really
that.
wanted. They really wanted them.
These weren't just your run of the mill. These kids were kind of special.
They
Go ahead.
they were friends early on with these people. It's how they were able to bring them down. In fact, one of the first things that they were like the Freaks and Geeks crew in the show. They would start clubs and things at their high schools. They were all at 3 different high schools in the area, and they would have groups that weren't just like AV club stuff. It was they would talk about movies, and they tried to at one point make a short film based on a Ray Bradbury short story. And by a wild coincidence, one of their other friends, Phil Tippett, who was in the area, who was really obviously into monster movies and things like that, wanted to do the same story. So they were all working with Ray Bradbury to make it happen in high school as kids who needed their parents to drive them around. They got to use the zoo there because Scott Shaw's dad was the security guy.
We let them in behind the scenes to shoot in the zoo.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone else's mom.
Yeah, so all these guys are
They're
being
doing
driven
that.
around by their moms.
Yeah,
to
they
go
were just
do all
kids.
this stuff.
And they were making a short film for Ray Bradbury, who, by the way, back then you could like call him up and he would, talk with you and whatever. And they started hanging out at Jack Kirby's house.
It just went up.
They would just go
They
to
loved
Jack
to use
Kirby's
Jack
house.
was in the phone book because
No, it was Shell. That was
Shell?
that was a big part of what Shell brought in.
Ah.
Shell had his problems, but one thing everyone agrees with is he had the black book. Shell was how they got in touch with a lot of people, and all of a sudden they get the biggest comics guy, Kirby. They get the biggest science fiction guy, Bradbury, both of whom were involved in Comic-Con from the beginning. Helped them to really shape it as spiritual guides. They asked Kirby, should this just be comics or should this be everything? Kirby said it should be everything. A year later, in 1971, he started talking about, everyone, I want you to know that in the future, Hollywood's going to come here and they're going to be looking at us for stories and they're going to want to talk about what they're doing next year. And everyone thought that he was crazy. And he said that in 1971. And so Kirby was very much like a guide. And then another guy named Forey Ackerman, who created Vampirella, but also famous Monsters of Filmland. A lot of people kind of consider him sort of the patient zero of kind of professional geeks. Like that was kind of what he did.
I know him. I met.
Did you ever go to the Acker Mansion?
I didn't go to the Acker Mansion, but I
He
did
had
have
his own
dinner with
mansion
him.
filled with all this shit.
Yeah, I mean, he had a mansion that was like filled with like
They wanted
movie
to,
props, from
everything.
Frankenstein.
It was a
the
place.
Mummy,
There's pictures of
everything.
it in the book.
But he had a ring that was this big of like a skull, and you could just tell when he was wearing it. He was like, "This is the scariest ring ever." He was just
They're bringing those people down. Yeah.
super nerd, but he was awesome because he was like sitting there talking to me, and I was like, it was like being with the guy who was going to show me a movie later. You know, he was like a creature feature host because he was just, and he had his hair was like.
He looked like a character.
like the grandfather on Munster.
Sure.
I mean, he had the whole
Aloes.
deal. He was real.
Yeah, so they were bringing those people down right away. They were very smart to do that. And those people coming out and doing it. And you got to remember, Kirby's only there because he wanted to be able to work on the West Coast because his daughter had some health issues. And finally, someone talked about this the other day at a panel. FedEx allowed people to move from New York to other parts of the country to start doing work for the comics company. Right. And of course, when Kirby left, you know, Marvel and DC are like, no, we got to figure something out. So he was able to work for them remotely, if you will, and he was really one of the first to go out because FedEx was a new thing, so it was more secured in getting back to them. So Kirby was right there on the West Coast, and when he started coming down and saying this is cool, then some of the other guys start coming out. They get Ditko and later Neil Adams, and everyone kind of makes it the thing. And Bradbury's telling all of his friends, come on out. So Kurt Vonnegut's going to come out, eventually Harlan Ellison, Robert Heinlein comes, even though he didn't do many conventions. Like, they had all the right people who were there throughout the entire thing. Bradbury went every year of his life until he died, from the very beginning till the end. He was, you know, he kind of, so they had those people helping, and all the people who were involved, like Scott Shaw, Stan Sakai early on, Sergio Aragones early on, you know, some of them had already done stuff like Sergio, but others kind of, they sort of made it all happen there. And there are a lot of stories like Stan and Kevin where they were kind of helping each other out. You know, Frank Miller talks about that. Neil Gaiman talks about when he used to get cassette tapes. People would give him cassette tapes and he'd listen to some of them. And one of them he really liked a lot. It turned out it was the early sides and demos for Tori Amos's first album. And that's how he became friends with Tori Amos. Someone gave him a sketch that he liked that Jill Thompson did. And then he stole her away from Wonder Woman to start working on Sandman. And they met at Comic-Con. They would like hang out and talk and make stuff. And a lot of people were very inspired by you. Jeff's not just in the forward. A lot of people talk about Jeff. There's like a Jeff Smith like section where everyone was like, "Oh shit!" Then Jeff like did a whole other thing. It's right in the middle. There's a section where they're "Holy crap!" Like, no, they're like Barry Short and a bunch of people talk about like how much you kind of made them go, "Wow, this thing is going to a whole other thing with self-publishing and whatnot."
A very interesting thing happened when I went to Comic-Con. The first time was in '92. I've been ever since. I've been going for over 30 years. But when I went the first time, it was '92. I'd only had like 3 issues of Bone out, and I got a phone call from Charles Vess, and he said, "Oh, I really liked your comic," and he was very complimentary. And I knew who Charles Vess was because I read comics, but I wasn't a big comic book fan. But I knew Charles Vess, and he said, "So, are you going to San Diego?" I said, "What's San Diego?" He says, "Well, that's where we all go." And he called it the Tribe. That's where we all go to meet the Tribe.
We all do still call it the Tribe.
We meet your tribes out there. And he says, and if you can get yourself out there, you can sit and have half my table. So I flew out there, met Charles Vess, who became one of my lifelong friends. He's still one of my best friends. And I think I had like 4 issues of Bone out, and I just had like an easel with some of the issues, like with a giant clip on it. But 2 years later, I was asked by the con that on Wednesday night they would have the retailers would have their own evening in the show, and it was called the Retailer Expo. And they said, "Will you do a poster?" They do a poster, a big limited edition poster for it, and they asked me to do it. They wanted Bone to be on this limited, and I by then I had maybe 10 issues out. But the Great Cow Race actually had kind of broke out and was it was big for for an indie. But I look back on that now and I think that was a shockingly generous thing to do, to give to a guy who just had didn't sell that many then. I was black and white, self-published comic book. But that was a thing about Comic-Con, and it's never changed. They, behind the scenes, people you don't ever see, and the people you do, they love the geeky shit that they love. And they fell in love with my book and didn't care that it was just a little dinky book. They let me do this poster, and I was a big deal, so I made a nice poster. And there it was. It went out. It was the collectible poster that every retailer wanted to have, and bam! In 15 minutes, everybody knew who I was. That was such a nice thing to do. And I became very friendly with everybody at Comic-Con, Faye and Jackie, which leads me to a question. I didn't see Jackie in this book very much.
Yeah,
and she was. I mean, before I answer that.
Yeah.
Okay, so I've been going to Comic-Con all these years, and I knew these people. I know Scott Shaw. I know all these people. I did not know this story. This is a very interesting story, which I hope you're picking up. That we're talking about these people who are getting their moms to drive them to. Oh, we're having a meeting to organize it. Mom's dropping them off. This is an amazing story. But I didn't see Jackie.
Yeah, it's actually because I assumed that question would come up. For those of you who don't know, Jackie Estrada is one of few people who's been at every single Comic-Con that's happened. I think she's one of, at this point, 5, maybe 6. She also has been managing the Eisners pretty much since they started, and is just very involved in the Comic-Con scene.
And she and her husband did with Bat and Lash.
Yeah, she was Bat Lash.
Supernatural Law for
Bat Lash, her husband, did a lot of great stuff. And Bat Lash, who passed away, is still very much beloved by everybody in the scene, and Jackie's got a lot of respect as well. Jackie was definitely one of the people I reached out to and knew I needed to have involved in the podcast series, and she was more than happy to do that. She also helped us get in touch with a few different people and kind of helped with just some facts and figures and things like that. When the book project started coming together, I had talked with her about getting some photos and such, and she was concerned, and we discussed this at the back of the book, that her involvement with the book would somehow make it look like this was an official or an authorized history, which it necessarily was not. I focused a lot on the people who created Comic-Con, the people who were involved in the early years. I didn't really talk too much with some of the people who are running it now, which is overall a different group of people. I had talked with a few of them when the podcast came out. They really seemed to like and that kind of thing. But as one of them themselves said, if we had done this through Comic-Con itself, it would have had to be very attenuated, because this is neither, an attack on nor like a commercial for Comic-Con. But there's stuff in there that's definitely warts and all, and a lot of people are getting some grievances out there, especially some of the stuff about Shell. So it just would have been very difficult to do this through the con itself. All my other projects, the same kind of thing. And a lot of people, the guys that did the MTV book, for example, and others, always like to make that point, a lot of documentaries, to not be official, because that way you're able to talk about some of those things and it's more objective. And that was very important for us.
I think it comes off very well.
Yeah, so to answer that, Jackie had asked us to not represent her in there with her interview that she had for the podcast or photos and such. But we do mention all this at the end of the book. I wanted to make it clear how grateful we were for her for supporting the podcast and helping us out. And there are people who talk about Jackie. You can't not. You can't tell the Comic-Con story without talking about Jackie, especially when you get to the Eisners and such. So people talk about her. But at her request, we did not have her actual interview and such in there. And hers was actually one of the short ones anyway from the podcast series. Some people we talked to for 3 or 4 hours. Hers was more like 20 minutes because, again, even then, she just didn't want there to feel like there was anything going on where it was like an official thing or anything like that. So
I did read that explanation
Yeah.
at the end of the book, but I still thought she was there. Well,
Yeah, no.
I mean, she might not have been in that the kids that were getting driven there, but she was.
No, she was there since the beginning and has always been very helpful and everything. Look, the reality is it's my interview and I could have put it in, but I wanted to respect her wish to not be involved, and so. That's what we did, but I still allowed people to kind of talk about her and that kind of thing. And, I will say this also, there was the podcast, there was the book. There's obviously other forms that we might want to take in the future, and I would like to keep relationships good with those people, especially Jackie, because as we do other versions of this that I think are warranted, it would be great to get them involved if they want to be, and if not, then not, So I want everyone to be as involved as they want to be or not. I will say one thing that makes me very happy about this is, as you can imagine, with a lot of these people who are a bit nerdy, a bit curmudgeonly, some of them, a bit persnickety about this, it's their story. They are very clear if they don't like something. They're very clear if something is wrong. And I dealt with that all through the podcast and a lot of other things. Many of these people I've become very close with. Some of them I'm actually working with on different projects. They tell you if they don't like something. No one has given me any kind of negative feedback or even, oh, you got this wrong or that wrong or anything like that. Everyone's been extremely excited about it. And I can tell you at least a few of them would have made it very clear to me if I got anything wrong. So I think we did it correctly, but it's hard to say. I feel bad for Michael. Do you want to ask another question, Lori?
Well, we got to open up to
Okay.
Q&A in about 5 minutes. But
Yeah.
I did want to point out how the book is not just about the history of San Diego Comic-Con. It is placing that within the greater context of nerd culture kind of emerging into the mainstream. And not also, you a little bit, you chart the history of San Diego itself alongside the growth of the con. And I just wanted to see if you wanted to talk about how you kind of came about that, or creating that kind of thesis for it all. And then keep in mind, we do want to open up for Q&A in about 5 minutes or so.
Can you ask the first part one more time again?
So
Robert?
your chart, it's not just the history of
Yeah.
of the Comic-Con. You're kind of tying it into the emergence
Of the larger geek culture.
Yes, yeah, and
Okay.
like what made you? Because it makes sense when you're reading the book, and now like it's so nerd culture has kind of saturated the mainstream, but and it seems so obvious reading the book now. But just how you kind of came to that kind of idea, I guess.
As mentioned, for me, a big part of it was I wanted to figure out a way to tell the ultimate pop culture history story, the ultimate fandom story. I'd been writing about all these very specific properties like The Simpsons or Nickelodeon even though that was a network, it's still pretty much, especially back then, the era I was writing about, it was pretty much, of a piece. It was all kind of the same sort of aesthetic and community and people making it. So I want to find a way to make something that was much more expansive. I'm a big Robert Altman fan, for example, and as I said, I've read a lot of other oral histories. People like James Andrew Miller did the Saturday Night Live book and the ESPN book. I just wanted to create something that was much bigger and more expansive. And so I came to Comic-Con just because I learned that it is the largest pop culture gathering. I was kind of looking at other festivals and things, and I knew somebody, Wendy All, who was one of the original committee members, who could help me out. Plus, as mentioned, when I first started coming up with this idea, the Comic-Con 50 had just happened, the 50th anniversary Comic-Con. So that all kind of came together. So it was really more, I came to Comic-Con because I'd already wanted to do a big pop culture fandom oral history book, and that just seemed to fit the bill as far as having a narrative thrust with that. As far as maintaining that throughout, I really did my best in curating who we were going to be talking to get people from lots of different worlds and fandoms. Definitely I wanted to talk to a lot of the creators of Comic-Con. There's some great stories there. We've talked a lot about some of these people. They were very interesting and went on to do big things themselves. People like Brink Stevens, who also became an actress and a scream queen and makes still to this day like 10 movies a year and all this kind of stuff like that. All these different very interesting people who were involved. Brink, by the way, was also Dave Stevens' widow. And so I really wanted to make sure I was getting science fiction people, fantasy people, folks from my own network. I had done a book on The Simpsons, as I said, and I know that Simpsons is, a part of this world in a way. And there's always a lot of Simpsons presence there, and I know that the Simpsons people are big fans of the convention of comics. So I was friendly with Al Jean, who's been running the show since 2001. So I got him in there, and he talks about that, and Matt Groening, and and so forth. Bruce Campbell, to get kind of that who better to get that element. Lloyd Kaufman, who I will always put and have always put in every single book I've ever written. He's probably even in my Nickelodeon book somewhere.
From Troma.
Yeah, Lloyd Kaufman. Troma. Also, he was the production coordinator on My Dinner with Andre.
I was at a Comic-Con in Chicago one time,
Yeah.
and the Trump guy walked by in his big Reese suit, right? And he comes by. I'm sitting over here, and I've got my comic books out, and he walks over, and he's got this. He's dressed as like nuclear waste man, right? He's got
Toxic Avenger.
He's got his eyes are falling out, and anyway, he's looking around his table, and all of a sudden his his penis comes up. It's a big puppet. And his penis has an eye on it. He's looking at all my books.
Sounds like trauma.
That's it was trauma.
That's what I'm saying.
I'm just like,
That's what trauma does.
No, and I can tell you a Matt Simpson's San Diego story. He showed me a trick one time. He goes, when you get done your signing and you want to leave your booth, he says, always grab a box so your hands are full, so you can walk and people are like, oh, sorry, I got it by hand. And I do that to this day.
There's some great pictures of Matt Groening when it's still in the Life in Hell days in there, and there's a lot of discussions. Matt was definitely kind of a regular out there, and I think Linda Berry too, right? Wasn't Linda Berry?
Yeah,
at
yeah,
lunch?
but I got to know Matt more in the
Okay.
Simpsons era.
Yeah, but Matt was there kind of early on. Yeah, so just to wrap that up, I really wanted it to be about that because that was the story of Comic-Con, and I kind of looked into that because I, like a lot of people, thought that Comic-Con had gone from being just about comics to all these other things are really Hollywood, but really that presence was there from the very beginning, be it a special section just for Star Trek in 1973, or having people like Frank Capra come very early on, or Chuck Norris very early on. I mean, there were a lot of
Timothy
different.
Leary.
Frank Capra and Chuck Norris.
They actually fought each other. There's video of it, that we have, yeah.
There's a great story in there. Before we get to the question, there's a great story about Tim Leary coming to the convention, and I can't think, it's not coming to my mind, the guy who gets upset about it, who is the Tarzan artist and all that, gets upset because
Vern Hogarth?
No, it wasn't Bern Horgoth. I can't remember either.
He's a
I'm
famous
blank
guy.
with,
like
he's
I,
one of the Tarzan people.
Yeah,
but
so
Russ Manning?
Yes, that's who it
Yes,
was. Yes. He gets upset because Leary's there, and they kind of have to have this kind of compromise of how they can still keep Leary there and Russ Manning happy and not upset with his presence.
Just give Russ a little cup of tea. He'll calm down.
Leary came right after getting out of prison, and in fact, his probation officer had to be there with him. They just all happened to be at a radio station together, and he was talking, and some of the Comic-Con kids were there, and the Comic-Con was happening. That's why they were at the radio station, and they were like, "Hey, Mr. Leary, come with us." And the guy went, but he had to bring his probation officer, and they did. They actually, and we have a great picture in the book. It's actually the postcard of Timothy Leary, Dave Scroggie, who was the program director that year, looking right out of like either Easy Rider or Inherent Vice, and George Clayton Johnson, who was another regular. And for those who don't know, you have a treat in store of who this guy was. He co-wrote the Star Trek pilot. He co-wrote Logan's Run. He co-wrote the original Ocean's 11 with the Rat Pack in it. There was a Rat Pack version first before the George Clooney version. He also wrote a few episodes of Twilight Zone, including the very beloved Kick the Can and many other things. And he was a big part of the Comic-Con as well as always around. And, he just passed away a few years ago too. So you'll find people like that where you're sitting there going, how the hell do we not know who this guy is? All these different things that he did. And there's a lot of people like that in there. And you learn more about certain other people, even like Trina and others who you think you know about. I mean, even Jeff, who was there, says he saw a lot and learned a lot in there because these are very fascinating people. That's why another reason I wanted it to be an oral history. They are such good storytellers. I could honestly say I love this book because it's not really me writing it. It's not really my stories. It's theirs. I just put it together as almost more like an editor or something. And I just love reading the stories of these very, very adept professional
All right, let's see.
storytellers.
Why don't we see if anybody does have a question?
Sorry.
If anybody does.
Please repeat the question.
Yeah.
Okay.
First of all, thanks for making this happen.
Oh, sure.
I'm curious with the legalities, getting all the photos. Have you go through that? And the other quick question I had was the design, as far as like making it like a file folder when that came to you.
Yeah,
Give me a second. He's asking about the legalities of assembling the photos and things like that, and then also the idea about how the book looks like it's a file folder and things like that.
The photos and art, I'll just keep it really simple. That was probably the hardest part about putting the book together. As you might recall, this was originally basically my director's cut scripts of the podcast series. So aside from some light work on that, I didn't have to do too much with the text. But because it was Fantagraphics, I want it to be very visually pleasing and to be something that's very distinctive from the podcast series. So I knew I needed a lot of photos, and I just reached out to everyone who was involved in the podcast who wanted to help. Most of the photos are theirs. Also, we really lucked out with Alan Light's collection and a guy named Clay Geertis, who was one of the few people who was a photojournalist back then, who had taken a ton of pictures. He passed away. His family was going to throw his photos away. A friend of his, Dave Miller, got the photos, was going to do a book of them and some exhibits and stuff, pandemic happened, so he couldn't. And I happened to be connected to him, and he said, as long as I can get him 2 copies of the book, he'd be happy to give me whatever photos I wanted. So we lucked out with him, Alan Light, and then everyone just got me stuff from their personal archives and whatnot. And I do want to be clear, because it's important, because I know other things like this have come out. In every single photo and art, it says who did it, credited by whom, the estate. We also got stuff from different museums and colleges, like UC Riverside and others. So people had, these are their personal things. As I said, this is as much theirs as mine. As for the design, Jonathan Barley, Barli. We knew we wanted to do something DIY, something kind of punkish, something kind of like zine-ish. He had just done a 3-volume set of a punk history, so we were able to use that. And I will say again, Fantagraphics' own oral history, We Told You So, is great, and we use that as a reference point as well. So, but yeah, Jonathan Barley, Barli. Use him, he's great.
2 quick questions. Proudest moment through the process of this book, and whether you're working on something already or not, what are you excited about doing that?
Asking about your proudest moment and what you're working on next. Proudest moment with the book.
Proudest moment, wow, that's
With the book,
with
not with your first date.
Yeah. My first date was with the book, actually. I was 40 years old.
Oh.
It's hard to say. It's the overall love and support that I've gotten from the people who helped me not only promote it now, but to put it together. I mean, I just wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise without everybody submitting and working with me on this and getting things right. They were extremely active through this whole entire process. And I have to again say that especially some of the people who were older and all having financial issues and such, we were working on this during COVID. So we were all like losing family members and going to funerals and dealing with lockdown and dealing with some of the political stuff that happened a little later too. I mean, it was a crazy time to be putting this together. And a lot of these people have a lot of health issues and things like that. And so just the fact that they rallied to help me do this at all is the biggest proud moment, really, I would have to say. Like just that everyone's come together. That Jeff helped out as much as he has. He's been promoting the heck out of it. His inviting me here, his doing this right now. It means a lot. And I know it's not just because you might like me or you might like the book. It's that you believe in this.
And what are you working on next?
What am I working on next? Through this, Rick Geary and I became good friends. Rick does a lot of really great graphic novels, usually on like serial killers and things like Lizzie Borden. And he is illustrating a novella of mine from 2008 called Daisy Goes to the Moon, which will be out through Fantagraphics. And we already have some of the sketches. So look out for Daisy Goes to the Moon by me and Rick Geary. Then in November, I have a Jewish encyclopedia coming out that's partly illustrated called The Little Encyclopedia of Jewish Culture. So, and if you want to make a living, kids, don't write encyclopedias. They're really great and fun to work on, and they look really big, but boy, they do not pay a lot of money.
I think we have time for probably one more question.
I'm wondering, because I haven't read this yet, but I'm looking forward to it. When you run festivals, you inevitably hear all the things that you didn't do, or that you did 5 years ago, that you should do, or where it should be that it's not. So I'm wondering if over the course of this oral history, you get some of the trajectory of what people thought should be a part of the festival, what their nostalgic for about the festival, and overall, like the pros and cons of how the festival has developed.
She's just asking about pros and cons of how the festival has developed, what people felt like at the beginning versus at the end. Is that, yeah?
The people that I talked to, because they literally created it and continue with it for many years, and some people came in at different times, like Dave Scroggie later with the Comic Book Expo and other things, and as the con started to grow and go to different locations and dealing with marketing and publicity, people like Faye coming in and John Rogers, that is absolutely one of the storylines that's going on. Once again, it's one of the reasons I chose Comic-Con, is because I knew that had a really interesting trajectory, whereas Jeff said, and we say over and over again, it really was kids who were getting driven around. I'm going to Pittsburgh to see Barry Alfonso for a thing, and he started when he was 12. And he was not getting people coffee, he was doing the publicity for the thing, going to radio stations and so forth and putting up flyers and whatnot. So those kinds of people definitely talk about how it went from that to as it grows and how they dealt with it, and it moved to these different locations and dealing more with the city and dealing more with, you know, different new elements and incorporating. There's a point where they decide they have to incorporate. Why they are a nonprofit is an interesting story also, but they had to teach themselves how to do it. And there's discussions even about, at a point in the 90s, they started going to conferences for expos and things to learn how to do it. So there is absolutely, and thank you for asking that actually, there's a story hidden in here of how to make a Comic-Con. That is definitely in here, because it's all these people who made it and then
I
different
wish I'd
people
have
online.
read that.
But yes, that's in there, and sometimes they get actually quite specific about it. So yes, thanks for asking that.
All right, I got something I'm supposed to read here. Land acknowledgement. Cartoon Crossroads Columbus acknowledges that the ancient ancestors of the Eastern Woodlands tribes, now referred to as the Adena and Hopewell cultures, inhabited the land we know as Ohio. Their descendants include the living nations of the Shawnee, Miami, Wyandotte, Delaware, and Seneca Cayuga. We honor and respect the diverse indigenous peoples connected to this place where we gather. We'd also like to thank our sponsors, including the Greater Columbus Arts Council, the Ohio Arts Council, White Castle, and UBS. So thanks everybody for coming out. Thank you to Jeff Smith. Thank you to Matt Klickstein.
Yeah.
Thank you all for coming and staying.
I-
It
I
wasn't
did-
too boring.